Hello, everyone. Welcome to Auvik's webinar on how to build a more effective service desk with our guest speaker, Rex Frank. Just before we go ahead and get started, just wanted to give a couple of updates on some housekeeping notes. We will be recording this webinar and it'll be available in a few hours at auvik.com/franklymsp, alongside a bunch of other blogs and podcasts really aimed at helping MSPs like yourselves to grow your business. And to ask a question, we'll be doing this throughout the presentation, so feel free to jump in if you have any questions at the time. So I'll be doing that as much as possible on the fly with the assistance of my awesome coworker Sam, and she'll also be doing some polls. But if we do have any questions that are a bit more in depth, we'll probably be saving them just towards the end of the presentation. So do stick around, and we'll get into some bigger questions at the end of the presentation. And today we'll be talking with Rex Frank, who is the founder and CEO of C-Level Operations. Rex is a business coach, and will really be helping us understand how to optimize your service desk for efficiency and productivity in a couple of really key areas. So I'm your host, Patrick Albert, AVP of Product Management here at Auvik. And as I mentioned, I'm joined by our guest, Rex. Rex has over three decades of industry experience in IT service delivery and over 26 years of experience specializing in managed services. So I'm really excited to learn more about in this presentation. This is a topic that's really important to me, along with automation, and really how to build out your service desk in the most efficient way. So really interested to see what Rex is able to provide us with today. So Rex, I'll go ahead and hand over the controls to you. And I'll go ahead and just kind of pay attention, jump in with some questions from the audience, and add any other feedback we have. So Rex, I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Patrick. I'm looking forward to talking with this group today. It's awesome to see this many Auvik loyalists joining the webinar. Just a little bit more about myself. I, 31 years ago, joined this industry as a tech, got promoted to service manager in the early 90s, was a member of a service executives peer group where for about 8 years, every quarter I was meeting with a group of my peers, and we were sharing best practice, holding each other accountable to financial metrics, setting strategic goals, and coming back to that group and having to explain to that group whether we met those goals or not. And it really changed me really from kind of that tech service manager really into that service executive role. I worked at 3 different MSPs in my career, and then in a senior director level role. And then about 10 years ago almost, I founded C-Level Operations with kind of one core purpose in mind, which was coaching IT solution providers and MSPs on getting their operations in order. And we've got like 87 different operational focuses that we coach on. And in this presentation today, really going to focus on the life of the ticket from triage, dispatch, time entry. And these processes that I'm going to have on the screen are the ones we use in our operations coaching. And they've been vetted through a little over 300 companies now. So one of the things that amazed me was I thought I knew a lot about operations 10 years ago. And just, in working with so many clients through the years and so many great coaches that are now part of C-Level, all of us bringing our own, what we've learned in all those years of managing these kinds of companies. What's happened to the processes over the years is just kind of blown my mind. So I'm really excited to be able to share it with you guys. Again, we're going to start with kind of life of the ticket, triage, dispatch, and time entry. And then I really want to spend some time talking about, we're talking about processes, but we got to get those implemented. And so let's kind of talk about the life of the ticket. This is a presentation, this whole completely separate presentation I've done a few times, where we talk about every time one of your engineers enters time, it's ultimately going to end up on some kind of an invoice. Maybe it's an invoice that's written off as a $0 invoice, or maybe you're actually billing the client, but that time entry has to be accurate. And we've got 5 chances to get it right. The first chance is when we triage the ticket, and that's kind of the getting the ticket ready to be worked by the engineer. The second chance is when the engineer enters their time. And to me, that's the most important chance to get it right. And in a couple of minutes, we're going to look at a flow chart here. But the third chance is when we close that completed ticket. And I generally, as the manager, I closed completed tickets for the engineers until I felt like they were doing it the way I wanted them to do it. And then I handed that position, that role of closing the tickets over to the dispatcher. And I found when I did that, the dispatcher learned a lot about what actually happened with the ticket after they dispatch it, right? They get to see the closing notes. They become just a little bit more technical. They get to see how long it took. They get to see who it got escalated to. But anyway, we're also checking to make sure that the time entries are correct. They have the right work role, right work type, the correct agreement or contract selected. Then we go to the timesheet approval. And again, we need to make sure that all those time entries are correct. And that job is usually done by whoever the practice manager is, whoever the engineers report to is usually doing this step. And then we take all that collection of time entries and we create and review the invoices. And that's typically in accounting. And my point here is if you find an error at 4 or 5, the mistake was usually made at number 1 or number 2. So if you're finding the error at number 5 here, making the invoice, we've already got it wrong 4 times. And, you know, using this methodology right here, it's the job of the practice manager to hand over a time entry to the accounting department that's ready to be invoiced. I find that a lot of companies are relying on, you know, they're doing number 2, engineers entering time, and then they're relying on number 5, accounting, to catch any errors. And in my opinion, that's a mistake. I think the service department needs to hand over a time entry to the accounting department ready to be invoiced. So notice my little star down here where it says send it back. As I move on to the flow chart, I want to, you know, you can see the number 1 here next to the triage process. The number 1, you know, that's our first chance to get it right, okay? So this is what I call the life of the ticket. So the ticket comes in, it goes to dispatch, and then the engineer is going to do work on it. They're going to enter their time, and if they need to escalate it, it'll go back to dispatch. If it doesn't need any escalation because they were able to finish the ticket, then they're going to put it in complete. And then here's number 3, where somebody's moving the ticket from completed to closed. They're doing the quality control check. Now, if there's an error, we want to make sure we're sending it back to the engineer, right? All these arrows point back to the engineer to correct their time entry. When we get to number 4, which is they've now submitted their timesheet for the week or 2 weeks or period, or, you know, whatever your timesheet period is, somebody's going to, you know, review and approve that timesheet. And again, if they find errors, they don't fix it. We're going to send it back to the engineer. I want to talk about why wouldn't we just fix it? I have a pretty hardcore belief, and in my opinion, this is an immutable law, that engineers will take the path of least resistance every time. And if the path of least resistance is to not really care about the quality of their time entry because somebody else will fix it for them later, well, then the path of least resistance is to just not get it right because somebody else will fix it later. But if you're diligent about sending the errors back, when you find errors in time entry, send it back to the engineer and help them understand this is where you did it wrong and have them fix it. And every time they get it wrong, it's coming back. What becomes the path of least resistance? Right, just getting it right the first time, because engineers don't like having to revisit the same thing again. And I understand, you know, it's the end of the month, we got to get our invoices out. You know, in that scenario, yeah, you probably have to fix it and make your invoice and get it out to the client. And that's why it's so important to do these checks throughout your billing period, so that you're not having to do all this time review check right at the billing cycle. So anyway, notice if it's wrong, you send it back. It goes right back to the engineer, right? So we close the ticket, and now we're down here in invoice or bookkeeping is making the invoice and looking it over, and guess what? They find an error. Where does it go? Right back toward the engineer. Okay. And again, if you guys have any questions, I'd like to address them while we're on the slides we're on. So feel free to jump in, and Patrick will assess the question. If it seems germane, he'll go ahead and jump in. Sounds like there aren't any questions on the life of the ticket, so I'm going to move forward here. So let's talk about triage. And again, we will be looking at a flow chart here in a second. But with triage, it's, the C-level definition is getting the ticket ready to be worked by the engineer. And there's a couple of important things that happen during triage. The first one is we have to make sure that we have the right company and contact, because those company and contacts, they set up a lot of things. They set up billing rates, they set up tax codes, they set up that the communication is going to the right place. They set up that if we have to go on site, that we're going to direct the engineer to the right place. There's a lot of stuff that has to be right there. And sometimes we have one contact managing multiple clients. They have a couple different companies, and we have to get the billing right. This is the first chance to get that right, is during triage. The second one is we need to adjust the summary. I can't tell how many tickets I've, seen in our queue where it says "help me" or "please help," and it's frustrating to me because I can't look at the ticket name and know what it's about. So that needs to get adjusted. The impact, urgency, and priority, we need to get those set, because that's what's going to control our SLA. Priority 1 tickets, they need to get triaged and dispatched within a couple of minutes. We need to start working on them within an hour, and we need to try to get them resolved within maybe half a day. But priority 3 tickets, maybe our goal is to get them resolved within 3 business days, and priority 4 tickets is our goal is to get them resolved within a month. So again, this is our chance to get that right. Our first chance is during triage. I'm an advocate of type, subtype, and item. For the Autotask users out there, it's issue type, and there's a third one. I can't remember the name of it. I apologize. But this is how we categorize our tickets. And it's, I'll tell you a quick story about what I see with this. Is I see most companies aren't categorizing their tickets, especially when they're smaller or have a lower operational maturity. And when they're not categorizing them, and we might even do a bunch of work to define out their types, subtypes, and items, but they still go along using the system and not categorizing their tickets very effectively. And what happens is we start working on understanding the financial, the profitability of our contracts or agreements. And then we say, wow, here's one that's really upside down. The client's paying us $1,000 a month, and we're doing $3,000 worth of work every month. Well, gosh, let's go look and see what kind of work we're doing. And the first time we go to run that report, and 3/4 of the report is uncategorized, where they never set the type, subtype, and item, or ticket type and issue type. And we're just like, oh man, I wish we'd been doing that. And it seems like that's the exact cycle that I see over and over and over, where it doesn't get used until you want to use the data, and then suddenly it gets used. The other interesting thing is we can start to understand our budget hours. Every time we do a workstation replacement ticket, we did 100 of those tickets, and we got 400 hours in there for those 100 tickets. That means our budget needs to be 4 hours. So again, if we're not categorizing our tickets, we don't know what they'll be. Again, setting the budget hours, that's something that as your operational maturity level increases, you'll start doing. Same thing with configuration items. When you have, I don't know, up to 5 engineers, there's kind of a tribal awareness of what's going on with the config items. But like, oh, we've had that problem on that computer before. But as you exceed, 5 or 6 or 7 engineers, that tribal awareness goes away. And really the only way to track if we're having multiple related incidents and we need to escalate at the problem status for root cause analysis, the only way to do that is if we're attaching configurations. The last thing here is to determine how it's getting paid for. And I'll go ahead and have the graphic up while we talk about that. So let me describe what's going on here. We got the ticket comes in, hits our triage board, sort of like that inbox on the top of your filing cabinet, because it hasn't been organized or filed yet. We're going to look at the ticket, separate individual requests into individual tickets. For the ConnectWise users out there, this got a lot easier with that copy ticket function, right? I can't tell you how many times I saw a ticket come through that says, hey, can you set up this new user account and then set up a new computer form? And then I see it worked its way all the way through the help desk. We got the user account created, and now the ticket's closed. And we never did the computer setup. And that sort of underscores why we need to separate these, because one goes to our help desk and one goes to our on-site installation team. So we want to make, again, company contact. Notice this 12-minute bar. We want to get all the way through these boxes and onto the right board, not in a new status, right? To get us to the we have responded status within 12 minutes. To me, that's 2/10 of an hour. Then this is our first chance to get the invoice correct is during triage. So let's go ahead. If we know this ticket's going to go on site and the work type needs to be on site, we should go to the finance tab on the ticket and set it up for to default to on-site work type. Same thing if it's going to be remote. Then let's let the finance tabs set it to remote, and that way when the engineer enters their time, it'll default correctly and likely be right. But let's talk about this. Is this covered by their flat fee agreement or contract, or is this covered? Or are we going to bill them time and materials for this? Most of the tickets that come in, we're going to put it on their agreement or contract and move on to dispatch. But let's take a look at what I got going on over here. When you have a technical services, a break fix client, their expectation is if they ask you to do work, you're going to send them a bill for it. But as soon as they become a managed services client, if they ask you to do work, their expectation is that it's going to be covered by their contract or their flat fee agreement. So if you're being asked to do something that is not covered by their contract, it's incumbent upon you to get permission from them to do the work before you do the work. So I want to make a note in the ticket that, hey, we've determined this is not covered by their contract. And then we got some decisions. If it's under 2 hours, we're going to get verbal approval from the client that they understand that it's not covered by the contract. If it's between 2 and 4 hours, we're going to email them from the ticket and ask them to respond to email that they understand that this is, 4 hours worth of work is not going to be covered by their contract. If it's over 4 hours, then we need to let sales know and actually get a scope of work created. And then there's a caveat here that if it's a priority 1 or a priority 2 ticket, we're going to go ahead and move to dispatch, right? We're not going to tell somebody with a server down, please get out here right now. Hold on, we got to send you a scope of work first. No, we're going to go ahead and start the dispatch process, understanding that it's a priority 1 ticket. But in all cases, there's going to be a note in the ticket explaining that the client authorized this many hours. And we'll continue on to dispatch. Yep.
Hey, Rex, I just wanted to jump in because I think we've covered a lot of really, really good content here. And the last slide talking about all the different things, capturing information. I think it's important to note that I think that has immediate payback and also long-term payback in terms of, if you capture all that information and you're categorizing tickets right, and you're getting all this information right up front, obviously that makes sure it gets to the right technician and they know the context and they know all the stuff so that they can jump on and start working the issue right away. But the bigger impact and kind of the less selfish reason for the technician is really to understand the bigger picture and understand, where are your opportunities for automation? Where are your opportunities for efficiency? I know you'll get into that in a minute, but I think it's really important to know from, I think from experience, working as a help desk person. I think it's, there's the selfish reasons of making sure this information gets to me and it is accurate, and I can worry about all the other pieces, how to solve the issue, but all the information that's gotten to me is awesome. But then, bigger picture, you can help solve that. I think one of the questions I'd love to ask the crowd at this point is, so you mentioned the concept of dispatching a couple times already. Well, I'd love to understand from an MSP's perspective, how many of you are actually using like a centralized dispatcher rather, or are people self-dispatching your own tickets? I think Sam will go ahead and pop up a poll there, and Rex, if you want to go ahead and review the results, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, we're going to give it a few seconds. So everybody should be kind of clicking their radio button and clicking submit. While we're waiting on that, I want to talk about where this process in the bottom right came from. As a service executive, director of operations, I started going on some sales calls with our sales department. And, this is probably 2010 timeframe. And I started asking some of these MSP prospects that we were talking to, what's going so badly with your current MSP that you're willing to leave them? And a very common response was, well, we got this flat fee contract and we keep getting these other invoices and we don't understand why. So I thought, I know why. It's because they're not getting permission to do non-covered work before they do the work. So I told the sales department, hey, how about we turn that into competitive advantage? How about we make an impossible promise? And if anybody's has read The E-Myth by Michael Gerber, he talks about if you want to make your processes better, make an impossible promise, and if you fail to deliver on that promise, then you have to pay. So I said, let's make an impossible promise. Let's say if you ever get an invoice from our company that you're not expecting, we'll mark it no charge. Well, guess how I made sure that we marked it? They never got an invoice from us they weren't expecting, is this process down here. So I got the results. It looks like 38% of us are self-dispatched and 63% of us have moved to use centralized dispatch. So that helps me guide the next section of the presentation here a little bit. So let's talk about dispatch a little bit. To me, remember, triage was getting the ticket ready to be worked by the engineer, and dispatch is choosing the engineer and scheduling the ticket. Now, I will say, C-level has an opinion that if it's worth being a ticket in ConnectWise, then we need to know who's going to do it and when they're going to do it. In our opinion, there should not be tickets in ConnectWise that are not on somebody's calendar. If they're not important enough to be on somebody's calendar, they shouldn't be a ticket. And that's one of the tenets that we advocate companies live by. So as we go through dispatch, we're going to talk about managing the help desk tickets. We're going to talk about something we call a quick fix ticket, a little bit about teams and pods, escalations, and then we'll talk about some of those priority 1 or priority 2 tickets. So here's the flow chart. And if you can draw a line across the middle, the top half of this chart is about how do we choose which engineer does the work. And the bottom half of this is how do we decide when they're going to do the work, right? So the top half is who, the bottom half is when. On these 3 columns, it's our tier 3, our level 3 engineers is the gray column. This kind of salmon color column down the middle is our level 1 and level 2 engineers. And this far right column is the special case in that it's a priority 1 or priority 2 ticket. So most tickets are going to come in from triage, and it's going to be a level 1 or level 2 help desk. We assess the priority. Most tickets are going to be priority 3 or 4. And this one here is what we call quick fix. So the best way I found to explain quick fix is when you walk into the fast food restaurant and there's 3 or 4 people in line, and you happily go to the back of the line, and when it's your turn to order, you order your burger, your fries, and your Coke, and then you get it and you go back to your table, right? But now you're sitting at your table and you're like, oh man, I need my drink refilled, or I need another packet of ketchup. You don't go back to the end of the line where there's 4 or 5 people in line, right? This is a quick thing. You don't do that. You just walk right up to the counter and you get their attention. You make eye contact. They hand you, and you say, hey, can I get my drink refilled? You hand them your cup. They give it back to you, and you go back to your table. And that's not really cutting, right? Nobody in line gets upset about that because they'd probably all do the same thing. And that's kind of the same thing as this concept of quick fix. As tickets come in, you've got this line of tickets that's stacked up needing to be worked, but then somebody says something real simple like, hey, can you fix my password, or can you unlock this account, or can you do something really quick? Hey, they already told me how to do this, but I forgot the steps. Can you remind me what they were? That's what I would call a quick fix ticket. And you should always have sort of somebody on standby. We like to call it the quick fix engineer. In larger organizations, there might be a team that's just handling these quick fix tickets. Some companies choose to kind of run all the tickets through the quick fix process, where there's a limit of 15 minutes before it has to be escalated into the normal dispatch queue. There's lots of ways to think about this, and it might change as the size of your company changes. For the smaller companies, I generally say, hey, set aside an engineer for half a day and say, okay, you're on quick fix, and you stack them up with non-client facing tickets like your backup checks or your documentation updates, or something they can be working on that's not client facing. That way, if something quick comes in, you can just redirect them real quickly to work on that, and then they can get back to working on the non-important stuff. But that's the idea of the quick fix. I will say one of the tricks is we call it the escape route, where you wouldn't want that person going up to get their drink refilled, going to the front of the line, and then saying, hey, while I got your attention, can I get a burger and Coke and fries to go, right? Because now they really are stepping in front of that big line. So we talk about the escape route, which is, hey, I have another call in 10 minutes, and you specifically use 10 minutes, even though you have a 15-minute kind of time limit. But I think I can get this done for you real quick. And that is really going to raise client satisfaction just by kind of saying those words. And then, as long as you can get it done in 10 or 15 minutes, everybody's happy. But if you're starting to get to that 15-minute mark and it's a bigger problem than you thought, or there's more to it, that's when you do your escape route and you say, hey, I've got that other call I was supposed to be on a couple minutes ago. I need to get this back into dispatch. And then basically you're saying you got to go to the back of the line with everybody else, kind of thing. So that's the concept of quick fix here. If it's great, if it's fixed, we're going to complete the ticket. If it's not, I recommend that you've got a primary engineer assigned to each of your managed accounts, which would typically be a tier 3 engineer, and you also would have a secondary engineer assigned to each of your accounts. Not that they do all the work, right? If you look at this, this does allow the work to get spread around, but they are the 2 individuals that kind of know the most about that account, and they help prepare for your quarterly business reviews. They help manage agreement profitability. They're primarily responsible for managing the minimum documentation. There's some responsibilities that they have, but by no means does it mean they're the only engineer that works on that account. But basically, if this is a easier issue, we're going to first look and see who their secondary engineer is, and if they're available within SLA to do the work, that's our first pick. Remember, this top half is choosing the engineer. If that individual is not available, then any other level 1 or level 2 that's available would be my second pick. If they're not available, I'm going to look to the team tab and see who that client's primary engineer is, and that would be my pick. If they're not available, I'm going to go to any other level 3. And if I can't get any of our engineers scheduled to work on this within SLA, then the dispatcher needs to escalate to management and explain the problem. So if we needed 2 or number 3 here, or number 4, one of our level 3s, we're going to jump over to this scheduling method. Otherwise, we're going to jump to this scheduling method. And the difference with my level 3 engineers is the dispatcher is much more of an assistant. You know, they contact that primary engineer and they ask them, or that level 3, and they ask them, hey, this is what we got. It looks like you're available tomorrow morning. Well, does that work? You know, do we need to do any other juggling? It's kind of a discussion with the tier 3 engineer and the dispatcher, and then they jointly make a decision the best way to handle this, and then the dispatcher kind of carries out the rest of carries out all the communication and making sure that that schedule gets done. So the dispatcher then is the one updating the ETA and everything. What's important here is number 2 is the dispatcher is managing the level 3 engineers to a very specific start and end time on their calendar. So their day is pretty full, but it's all got very specific start and end times, really marked as firm on their calendar. What's different about the way I manage the help desk tickets is number 4. Let's see. They're dispatching the order to be worked, not necessarily a specific time, and we use the firm and tentative. So I generally set the default for my dispatcher's workplace or in ConnectWise, the dispatch portal, to be tentative. So anytime we create a new schedule entry, it's tentative. And really, we're using the calendar more like a queue. We're stacking them up in the order to be worked, not necessarily a specific time slot. Now, if you confirm to a client, hey, you need to talk to this client at 1 o'clock, well, then they would mark it firm in the calendar. But otherwise, tentative means just work on them in this order. And we'll use the escalation workflows to how long tickets can get worked on. And then over here on the right is, hey, if there's an emergency, like this is determined, you know, the system's down, the client can't work, dispatcher is going to make that determination. Normally, I don't have the closed loop turned on tickets with all that. I don't want to drown my client with emails about for every update on their ticket. But on these P1 and P2 tickets, I think it's appropriate to have all that closed loop stuff turned on. And we're going to add the primary engineer, the account manager, and make sure the client is apprised. So all notes that hit these tickets are going to get reflected out to everybody to keep everybody apprised of what's going on. Most of the time, dispatcher is going to look at the calendar and say, man, I don't have anybody available, right? And it's going to come down here to no. Occasionally it's yes, and they can just schedule them. But when a P1 ticket comes in and everybody's booked, we got to make a decision on which client we're going to upset, because we're going to have to pull somebody off of something. And that's generally, I want the manager to make that executive decision of which client we're going to upset in order to get somebody over to work on this priority 1 ticket. So, but once that decision's made, the dispatcher will carry it all out. So, Patrick, did we have any questions on this?
Well, I think I just had a couple of quick questions.
Okay.
So what the last poll that we did was around understanding whether you're self-dispatched or you have a centralized or a dedicated dispatcher. Do you have any? I guess it's a two-part of question. I'd say, do you have any thoughts as to when in an organization do you actually move? Would you suggest making that shift? So what size of team, or are there different other triggers that would suggest that this is a good time to start centralizing it? And then, as a second part of that question, if you're potentially not that size just yet, how would you change this particular process to adapt to the self-dispatching model?
Well, it's interesting. The process probably, let me answer your second question first. The process probably doesn't change a whole lot. The steps are still germane, right? We still need to follow the steps. We need to get it on the calendar in the right way. The question is who is doing the dispatch? And just a quick anecdote, I'm going to use an analogy. The airports, right? Down the street from my house is a little country airport, and there's no control tower. And when the pilots want to use the airport, they got to be on a certain frequency, and they announce, hey, I'm here and I'm coming from the south and I'm 3 minutes out, getting ready to land, and somebody will go, I'm 5 minutes out, why don't you go first? And they go, okay, right? Literally, it's a self-dispatch model. But just 15 miles away is SeaTac International Airport, and there's a control tower. And they've decided there's too many planes in the air to, it'd be too much broadcast. The broadcast protocol there would just be too chatty. And then, people wouldn't be able to keep up. So they went to a centralized air traffic controller who monitors all the traffic and keeps everything lined up so that they don't have collisions. And I think that exact same analogy applies in our businesses, right? When there's just a handful of tickets and a handful of engineers, a broadcast, everybody's aware kind of model works fine. And I might even argue that's the best way to do it. When you start to get about somewhere between 5 and 8 engineers, that's when the broadcast, everybody's aware model starts to break down. And by the time you get to about 10 engineers, you almost have to be in a centralized dispatch model. The question is, do you want to teach 8 engineers how to redo the way they work, or do you want to teach 3 or 4 engineers how to redo the way they work? I'm going to go with 3 or 4, which means the sooner you move to a centralized dispatch model, the sooner you're more prepared for the growth. That answer that question?
Yeah, I think so. And I think maybe just to add to that, I think potentially maybe even in a smaller environments, and I'd love your thoughts on this, but I think one thing I've seen work really well is kind of group together the dispatch role, but not necessarily make it a dedicated person. Maybe it's just, maybe not a full dedicated role and job, but maybe make it a part of someone's job. So kind of assign someone as the prime dispatcher. They're working other tickets themselves, but they're also, taking on a lot of the centralized dispatching capabilities. Does that make sense?
Yeah. In my organization, we had, in ConnectWise, red arrows means things are scheduled in the past, and green arrows means things are scheduled in the future, right? And I was in this one staff meeting, and I was talking about no red arrows, we want green arrows. And I came back from lunch, and apparently there's a comic book character called the Green Arrow. And the picture of him is taped on my door. And I still don't know who put it there, but I thought it was pretty funny. Well, come to find out, there's action figures. So I went on eBay and found the Green Arrow action figure. And what we did was whoever's desk the Green Arrow action figure was sitting on is who the dispatcher was. And it created a lot of clarity of, oh, it's my responsibility, the Green Arrow's on my desk, kind of thing.
Oh, that's definitely a really neat model. So I think that works well in the environment where it doesn't make sense to have one person that's all they do is dispatching. So I think that shared responsibility, but passing it around makes a great sense.
Yeah.
And those of you that do follow the Green Arrow, I think they've only got one season left before it's getting canceled. So.
Oh no.
Yeah, actually, so Rex, just one quick question, I think, before we move on. Would love to understand. So, like you talked about kind of the size where it makes sense to start centralizing this. Maybe from the crowd, I'd love to understand maybe what size what size of company are you? I think that might help us relate some of the next couple of questions. So, like, like how many staff do you have on hand, so we can start understanding how we can relate this back to the dispatch role. And Rex, I'll let you kind of take over summarizing again.
Yeah. So again, go ahead and vote, and I'm going to kind of start talking a little bit about time entry here, since I'm watching the clock. The key thing about time entry is when the engineer has to have a very defined process. Keep in mind, you can't hold anybody accountable unless you've defined your process and trained, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in that process, we want to make sure that we're taking ownership of that ticket, and then we're relieving ownership of that ticket. So it looks like most of us are 1 to 10 at 50%. 11 to 35 is about 46%, and a couple, 4% of us are up in that 36 to 50 range. So good. I think I'm talking to the right audience here. Good stuff. We want to talk about the statuses that need to be managed, a little bit about gatekeepers, So let's dive into this next slide here. So this is the engineer time entry process that C-Level uses during our coaching. And what I want to point out is right here, the engineer takes ownership by acknowledging the ticket, right? It's on their calendar as unacknowledged. Once they open it and read it, it becomes acknowledged. And here's the key is if there's any problems, and there's 7 or 8 things that the engineer is agreeing to when they acknowledge their calendar entry. They're agreeing that they've got the skills to do it. They're agreeing that there's no parts or supplies or tools that are going to be needed that won't be available in time. They're agreeing to the time frame. They're agreeing that they understand what the SLA is. They understand if they have to be on-site or remote. They understand if it's firm or tentative, right? And this is part of that two-way communication between dispatch and the engineer. Dispatch puts it on their calendar, and it's still kind of a questionable state until the engineer acknowledges it. But once they acknowledge it, they've agreed. I have ownership. There's nothing that I can think of that's going to prevent me from getting this done at the time you scheduled it for. If they have any issue with any of those things, they're going to put their notes in the ticket and change the status to scheduling required. So in that scenario, they never took ownership. They've given it back to dispatch with a reason why it's a problem. There's a side note here that priority 1 tickets require updates every hour. We're going to change the status to working issue now. We're going to make a decision here. Is this professional services, at which point the budget is controlling it and the client is controlling how much time we're allowed to spend on things? But if it's managed services, the client's not getting a bill for it, who's paying for it? That's right, the MSP is. So I need some gatekeepers in here, which says, hey, if you're working on this remotely, you must think about the solvability of this issue in 15-minute increments for up to an hour. So we should never have more than an hour put into a ticket before it's escalated. But we got to create a culture with the engineers that, hey, if you're 15 minutes into this and you haven't got a clue, you're a good engineer if you escalate it. You're a bad engineer if you keep spinning your wheels. Because we need to get that. There's no sense in just spinning your wheels because we're wasting the client's time. I'm actually much more concerned about wasting the client's time than wasting our time. And no matter whether you solve it or not, we got to get your time and notes, use this work type, and then we make this decision. Is this resolved or not? If it's yes, great. We put the ticket in a completed status and check yourself off as done. So you're checking your schedule off as done. That's where you're relieving ownership of this ticket. So you accepted ownership right here, and most tickets you'll put in completed and you relieve ownership right here. If it's not resolved, we want you to look and see, hey, does anybody else know how we might solve this problem? And that's this loop once. If you reach out to the team and say, does anybody know how to do this? You can go back in and spend more time working on it if you get an answer. If nobody can tell you what to do, then we're going to reschedule. And there's this box here where the engineer needs to basically communicate with the client and let them know, I didn't finish, I need more time, or I'm not sure, I'm going to escalate it. But in all cases, the notes are in there and the schedule is checked off as done, and they relieve ownership when they put it in a scheduling required. They're basically giving this ticket back to dispatch. I got a note in here that says, hey, engineers don't promise times to clients. That's what dispatch is for. You can let them know, hey, it looks like I'm open tomorrow, but I got to confirm with dispatch. But we're I don't ever want engineers in a centralized dispatch model promising any times. And then down here is that just ignore it. My dispatcher will figure out my mess for me is simply not an option. An engineer should not be leaving for the day unless all of their tickets they were assigned have notes in them, and they're either completed or scheduling required. So, and this box down here, I just want to hit on it real quick. I call it the penalty box, where if you failed to manage your tickets, right, you acknowledged it. I'm going to get these 11 tickets done today. And at the end of the day, you've only got 8 of them done. You can't just put it in scheduling required and make it the dispatcher's problem. You got to contact that client and let them know. You have to communicate with that client and let them know, I'm not going to get to it today. I'm going to give it to dispatch so we can try again tomorrow. And the main reason I want this communication to happen, I'm going to rephrase that. I never want that communication to happen. I'd much prefer engineers take 2 other options. Option number 1, which is better than leaving a client hanging, is not acknowledging what you don't believe you can get done and using this to let the dispatcher know, hey, you've got too many things on me today. I don't think I can get that done. Right? That's option 1. Option 2 is just keep your stuff together and get your day done. You agreed to it, get it done. That's way better than calling the client and saying, I didn't get it done, I'm going to go back to dispatch. But the main reason I want the engineer to do this is I want them to experience the disappointment in the client's voice. When they get to experience that, they generally start to take option 1, which is not acknowledge it and communicate with their dispatcher, I'm not going to get that done, or just get it done. So
Hey, Rex, actually, that dovetails into an interesting question that I know a lot of dispatchers face is, what happens when a technician that is fully booked has a sick day? Like, how do you go about potentially taking those tickets, redispersing them, or communicating them? How does that affect this particular workflow?
Yeah, so basically, the dispatcher is going to have to clean it up. As soon as they get that call that I'm not going to make it in today, that's the job of the dispatcher to redistribute everything, and based on go back to the dispatch process. We redistribute based on priority, then by age. So
right, I guess, and I think in that situation, I guess, so if you're going through and redistributing, you might not have, I guess, enough load to potentially kind of deal with all the different tickets that are coming up. And I think that's, I guess, where management would have to be informed and figure out where to go from there, right?
Yep, because you're in this box right here, right? You're looking at availability, and if you can't find anybody, you might have to escalate to management to make some decisions.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. I think that's a really good point. I think that's a really key role. So I guess one of the questions we were having is, so being how critical that role is, and I know it's not a simple role either, right? Because you're effectively making decisions to ultimately disappoint somebody, because you're not going to be able to work on everything. So I guess I would wonder, within the crowd, so as you start building out your teams, do you have anyone that you're actually grooming for management?
Yeah, so the root of this question is, as your company grows, for every 7 people, you need a manager. Nobody should have any more than 7 direct reports. And I find one reason that companies grow to a certain level and then they just stop growing is that they're not grooming their next level of management. So you might be 30 employees heading toward 50, but you're going to need 3 new managers to be part of that. So hopefully everybody's got somebody in mind that they're grooming for the next leadership position. Yeah, so 68% of us are grooming somebody for the next leadership position in our company, and the 32% of us that aren't really need to think about that. One of the things I was talking to a prospect for C-levels coaching the other day, and he was at 11 employees, and I said, who's in line? Who's your service manager? And he's like, I am. And I was like, okay, who's in line? And he's like, well, nobody. Nobody has any leadership skills. And I was like, well, then you have a 3-year problem in that we there's nobody in line. So you're stuck at 11 employees until somebody starts to take over that service manager role. And it was a big realization for him when that happened. And C-level is in the business of coaching those technicians to become leaders and managers. And the way we do that is by working through, when we engage, we don't want to work with the owner. We want to work with those managers, or even better, the person who's supposed to be becoming the manager. And what we do is we go through those processes with them. We say, okay, well, here's how the process should look, but let's figure out how to make it work in your company and work through it and make that process yours. And we always go through what we call the 5 phases. So phase 1 is understand the best practice. Like, other people have already figured that out. Let's reach out and learn from them. And C-Level has templates. The PSA vendors have templates. True Methods. There's a lot of different companies that have best practice out there that you can get your hands on. So step 1 is get your hands on that and understand it. Step 2 is make it yours and create those documents, right? Take those diagrams I was just talking about and make them yours. Maybe you don't want the budget hours set, or maybe you don't want the config item attached, or maybe all of your clients are flat fee managed services and you don't do any billable work. So delete all that stuff about getting permission to do the work. Whatever your way of doing it is, the most important thing is that it gets documented. Then once it's documented, we're going to train your team. So matter of fact, we want the person we're working with to do that training because we want them to be recognized as the expert in their company. And that's one of those natural progressions toward becoming the leader, is doing the training. After the training, we do phase 4, which is make the operational change, start doing it the new way. And it's interesting, what we find is almost any manager, no matter what their management skill, can do phase 1 through 4, right? They can learn the best practice, document out a process, train the team from those documents, start doing it the new way. The problem is, and what's probably the most important, yet the most under implemented, is the inspect what you expect. That's gonna tax every ounce of leadership that this manager has, getting it followed by all, taking that process and making sure that everybody's following that process. And it's really important that you're leveraging your newer managers to do these 5 phases. We want them doing it and not the owner or the established leader, because they're already the established leader. A big part of establishing a new leader is having them go through these 5 phases while you're putting a process in place. And in number 2, make it yours. If you have a dispatcher but you don't have a defined dispatch process, the current leader, the up and coming leader, and the dispatcher are the ones that should be working on creating this process. The more you can loop in the person that's creating it, the more they're going to buy into using it, and the better effect you're going to have in phase 5. So I want to talk about that 5th phase a little bit, right? Again, it's the toughest, most important phase, yet it's the least managed. It's going to test your leadership. When you're doing this, you're going to get a lot of, the established leader is going to get a lot of, how do I do this, or how do I do that? And in our coaching, we're constantly reinforcing that you have to come right back with a question that sounds like, well, what do you think? How would you do it? And then based on their response, you've only got one of 2 possible options. That sounds great, you're on the right track, run with it, or have you thought about? And it's really important you never just give direction on how to do something. You have to turn it right back around. Well, what do you think? And then, that sounds great, run with it, or have you thought about? Your only 2 answers. And this builds confidence. It builds confidence not only in what you're doing, but it builds confidence that it builds confidence in them that they can make great decisions. And it builds confidence that you have confidence that they can make good decisions. I've got here, let go of the seat. And, I like this picture where Dad's doing some teaching, and he's going to send her out to do some rollerblading, and he knows that when she goes out on her own, she's going to fall down, and there might be some blood and there might be some tears, but he's not going to go out there and say, oh my gosh, you should never rollerblade again. What's he going to do? He's going to go pick her up, wipe off the tears, get her going again. And it takes a lot of courage to let go of that seat. Like if you're teaching somebody to ride a bike, it's the same thing. You're running along behind them, holding onto that seat, and you let go, knowing that they're going to crash. That's okay. You're going to pick them up, and you're going to get running again, and you're going to let go of the seat again. But look at this picture. Notice she's got a helmet, elbow pads, knee pads. He's done a lot of things to try to protect her, and it's the same thing you're going to do with your managers, and your managers are going to do with their engineers. Is you have to have this culture that it's okay to fail. It's actually great to fail because they're learning, they're getting better. And along those lines, we've got this quality curve here where what's going on here is you've got your quality level here in time, and you've got somebody doing it that's doing it now above your minimum quality level. And then you start this transition to somebody else doing it, and it's going to fall below your minimum quality level. And as a manager, you're going to find yourself at this point, right? You let go of the seat, and now they're on the ground crying, and there's a little bit of blood, right? And a bad decision is to take it back, because you will go right back to your quality level and keep going. The good decision is to invest the time to teach and coach and get them back going again. Kind of the last thing I want to hit on is tie your measurement to your flow charts, right? I showed you a bunch of process flow charts. So as an example, we've got a box in our flow chart that says validate the budget hours. Well, in this case, this is a bright gauge display, but there's lots of gauge displays out there. But my phase 5 inspect what you expect, I'm going to say how many tickets don't have a budget hour set. And that's going to be one of the displays. So one of the things I've found really important is my performance measurements are going to measure our individuals following the process. And this is a huge step. This is a huge part of phase 5, is displaying whether people are following the process or not. That's really going to help you get everybody following your process. And notice this gauge is what we call managed to 0 or managed by exception. This should be 0. There shouldn't be any tickets. If this is more than 0, then somebody needs to take an action to fix and get us back in line with our process there. So that kind of wraps it up. We don't have a lot of time. I apologize, but Patrick, were there any hanging out there questions?
I'll just go ahead and just take a quick look through our question poll to make sure we didn't miss anything. But yes, while we do that, I just want to thank everyone for joining, and obviously thank you for our guest Rex Frank. This has been a really awesome webinar. Lots of really good content. And those of you that haven't been on a webinar with myself, my name is Patrick Albert, AVP of Product Management here. Apologize, I didn't do the intros as deep at the beginning. And we got anyways, we'll go ahead and throw some of the questions in just a minute. But if you are not familiar with Auvik or who we are or what we do, let us show you how Auvik can help you give a lot more context to some of these tickets that come in, along with complete network visibility and control. We've got a promotion specifically for this webinar. If you go to the link that's mentioned there, auvik.com/workflows19, and we'll go ahead and give you a $5 gift card as well. And again, thank you again for joining this awesome webinar on how to build an effective service desk. The recording will be available at auvik.com/franklymsp in just a few hours. And again, thanks again, Rex, for joining us here. So
I had a great time. Thank you, guys.
No worry. Yeah, it was awesome. So I'll go ahead and just jump into a couple questions in a second. And if you have any further questions, feel free to jump on our Frankly MSP community on LinkedIn. Sam sent out the link earlier. There's a great space for conversations and a bunch of resources, as I mentioned earlier, focused on helping MSPs run their business. So I'll go ahead and jump into any questions we have at this point. So just give me one moment just to review those.
Once again, thank you for having me. I had a good time. This is this is stuff I love talking about and I'm passionate about. If anybody has any questions, feel free to email me or Patrick. We'll be happy to answer those. Looks like most of you stayed till the end. I guess that's a good sign.
Yeah, it's definitely awesome. Actually, so one question that just popped up is around skill sets for the dispatcher themselves. You know, what types of skills would you recommend, and can they be an engineer?
So you're asking me a question about opinion, so I like to disclose when I'm giving opinion, but I'm not a fan of using a technician as dispatch. I think that the big problem is they tend to try to do the work rather than organize the work. And for that reason, I like somebody that's more administratively minded, who's more interested in organizing the work. I like somebody that's older. You know, you got to take off your HR hat for this one, but I personally like somebody that's older, that raised a bunch of kids through high school, you know, dealt with getting them up out of bed and helped them make sure they finish their homework and you know, pass their classes. And probably the thing I look for the most is if they volunteered to be some sort of a youth leader. You know, if they were the Girl Scout leader or the Boy Scout leader and they volunteered to organize a bunch of kids to accomplish something, those qualities line up almost exactly with what we need in a dispatcher. So that's my 2 cents. I don't know if you have any thoughts or comments on that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I know, again, opinion based, but I would definitely agree with that. I think that makes sense. I think, you know, the right type of engineer can definitely do it, but it's definitely a very different skill set.
Yeah, and you know, like I said, it's the administrative side of it that engineers in general, again, very generalized answer there, don't tend to have, they generally aren't very administrative. So having somebody that is administrative, holding them accountable isn't a bad thing. You got to be careful. Reminds me, in the dispatcher, the engineers don't generally report to the dispatcher. So as their manager, you can't expect responsibility without authority on the dispatcher. If there's a behavior problem, their manager has to fix that, not the dispatcher.
Right.
I've seen it a lot where the manager tries to get the dispatcher to change behavior, and that's just a management nightmare.
Yeah, that's a great point. So it looks like we are both out of time and out of questions. So again, thanks everyone for joining us on the How to Build a More Effective Service Desk with C-Level Operations Rex Frank. As I mentioned again, this webinar will be recorded, was recorded rather, and will be available on demand at auvik.com/franklymsp. And again, thanks a lot, Rex, for joining us and sharing some awesome concrete examples of workflows and some really good takeaways. And thank you everyone that was able to join, and see you on our next webinar. Thank you.
All right, guys, go get them.